After we've declared the data members for a class, the next step would be to create what are called constructor methods. Let me write that out for you. I'll put it in a comment here. Constructor methods allow us to instantiate or declare a class object and provide that object with some data. Constructor methods are always declared as public, and they're also always declared using the same name as the class. So we start out by writing public name, and then we provide parameters or arguments for the pieces of data that we want to provide to the class object in this constructor. So what I'm doing here is creating three parameters, F, M, and L for first name, middle name, and last name. So I close off the parameter list with a closing parenthesis. Then I come down and add an opening curly brace, move down a line, and all we have to do here are simple assignment statements where we write first equals F, middle equals M, and last equals L. And that's an L, not a 1. Sometimes it looks like a 1, but it's an L. So that constructor will be used to create a name with the first, middle, and last name. I say that because it's also possible to create more than one constructor. We can create a second constructor using the same beginning, public name, and in the parameter list I have to provide a different number of parameters than the one I did before. So for example, in the first constructor method I had 3 parameters, F, M, and L. For the second constructor I can only have 2 parameters, F and L. So what we'll do is we'll assign F to first, and then for middle name we'll just assign the empty string since a parameter was not provided, and for the last name we'll do L. Now it doesn't make much sense, but just to demonstrate and kind of stress this fact that we can have multiple constructors of the same name, we'll create one last constructor with just the last name. So we'll say first is equal to empty string, middle is equal to empty string, and then last name is equal to L. The reason we can have multiple methods with the same name is due to a feature of object-oriented programming languages called overloading. When you overload a method, you're saying that I'm going to use a method with the same name, but I'm providing a different set of parameters than any of the other methods with that same name. So you see I have 3 methods all named name, but each one has a different parameter list. This first constructor method has 3 parameters, the second method has 2, and the last one just has 1. That's how the compiler is able to differentiate between method calls with the same name, is by looking at the parameter list. And then it can flesh out which method you're trying to use or which constructor method you're trying to use based on which parameter list it's looking at. When we call a constructor, we provide it with data, and then that data is assigned to the object that's created in the declaration statement. We're going to demonstrate that in another lesson or two, but I just wanted to point out what we're doing with the constructor. Before we leave though, let's look at one last example. We can also have what's called a default constructor. And a default constructor has no parameters, and it simply assigns each data member a default value, usually based on that data type. So for a string, the default value for a string is the empty string, just like the default value for an integer would be 0, or for a double as well. So this way I can create a name object without assigning it any data at the time if for some reason I need the object without any data in it. So it's always a good idea in any class that you create to add a default constructor to the definition. Interestingly enough, the compiler will provide a default constructor for you if you don't provide one yourself, but it's usually a good idea in a class definition to go ahead and make the default constructor explicit so that someone looking at the class definition will understand exactly what's happening when the default constructor is called. So that wraps it up for constructors. That's just about all we can talk about, certainly at this stage of the course. Now we'll move to the next lesson in this chapter, where I'm going to create one more method so that we can display the data from a class, and then we'll also learn how to create name objects through a process called instantiation.